Module 8 reviews steps in the merger process associated with Concurrence Point 4A, Avoidance and Minimization. This module includes a brief overview of Concurrence Points 4A, 4B, and 4C, a detailed review of the steps associated with Concurrence Point 4A for both processes 1 and 2, and examples of Concurrence Points 4A avoidance and minimization measures. Concurrence Points 4A, 4B, and 4C occur after the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, the LEDPA, or the preferred alternative, has been identified. Concurrence Point 4A relates to avoidance and minimization of impacts. It takes a close look at the alignment and other parameters that can possibly be modified to minimize impacts to resources. Concurrence Point 4B is a review of the 30% hydraulic design plans, and Concurrence Point 4C is a review of the final permit drawings. Concurrence Points 4B and 4C are discussed in more detail in Module 9. Avoidance and minimization during the steps leading up to the Concurrence Point 4A meeting include: review the LEDPA alternative for any opportunities to avoid or minimize impacts to the natural, human, or physical environments through slight shifts in the horizontal or vertical alignment, adjusting slopes, and evaluating the use of retaining walls. Also considered are any seasonal moratoriums that may be required during the construction of the project. For example, anadromous fish, trout spawning, sea turtles, or manatee, and potential on-site mitigation. This slide depicts a snapshot of the specific steps associated with building from Concurrence Point 3 to Concurrence Point 4A for processes 1 and 2. Concurrence Point 4A for processes 1 and 2 looks to continue with avoidance and minimization for the preferred alternative and the documentation of all the steps taken to avoid and minimize impacts. For Process 1, Concurrence Point 4A confirms a best fit for the road within the corridor established in Concurrence Point 3. Avoidance and minimization has been part of the project development process since Concurrence Point 1. Concurrence Point 4A is the culmination of the steps that have been taken through the entire process to avoid and minimize impacts, from determining the initial study area, identifying the location of preliminary study corridors and placing the alignment within those study corridors, selecting the detailed study alternatives, and determining the LEDPA or preferred alternative. This step should involve only minor revisions to the design plans at this point. After selection of the LEDPA, a project team meeting will be held to discuss additional avoidance and minimization efforts that were not included in the preliminary design during the alternative analysis phase of the project. Concurrence Point 4A should address potential avoidance and minimization efforts, which may include shifts in the horizontal and/or vertical alignment, slope adjustments, and construction techniques. Service road locations and utility relocation should be reviewed for minimization. Keep in mind that when avoiding and minimizing jurisdictional resource impacts, other resources will be considered, for example, parks, protected species, historic sites, and commercial and residential development. For projects where bridge length and location were not previously agreed to, a decision on these parameters will be included in the Concurrence Point 4A meeting. Upon agreement that project jurisdictional impacts have been avoided and minimized to the maximum extent practicable based on current information and design available at the time, the project team members will sign the Concurrence Point 4A form. It should be recognized that additional minimization may be achieved during the final design process with more precise mapping. This includes the project hydraulic design, which will be addressed in Concurrence Points 4B and 4C. Upon reaching Concurrence Point 4A, the project development engineer will document all avoidance and minimization efforts that have been achieved to this point. This information will be provided to the project team and to the Natural Environment section for inclusion in the updated Section 404 permit application. Note that Concurrence Point 4A does not have to be completed prior to the issuance of the FEIS or FONSI. The next few slides show examples of avoidance and minimization. The first example shown on this slide is a scenario that demonstrates how avoidance and minimization is a process that takes place throughout project development, not just something that occurs at the time of the Concurrence Point 4A meeting. As new information becomes available through the project development process, additional target areas for avoidance and minimization measures can become apparent. The blue box in this slide shows the initial location of an interchange for the blue and brown dashed alignment. After detailed field studies were conducted, the alignment was shifted, as shown by the blue and brown dots, and the interchange was moved west of the schools to avoid and minimize impacts to potential suitable habitat for a protected species. Here we see the revised interchange, located to south of the schools. Corridor alignments and proposed interchange locations for the project were presented to local citizens at a corridor public hearing. The public expressed concerns associated with the revised interchange location, in particular access issues, that prompted the project team to further investigate ways to avoid and minimize impacts for this section of the proposed project. In response to the comments presented at the public hearing, several new interchange options were evaluated to find a solution that would both continue to minimize impacts to protected species and meet the needs of the public. The evaluation included efforts to avoid and/or minimize impacts to a number of other resources, including protected species, wetlands, schools, utilities, and residential and commercial development. Access, constructability, safety, and cost were also factors in the evaluation. This example demonstrates how avoidance and minimization can and does continue throughout the project development process. This slide shows an alignment shift on a new location project. In the upper right-hand corner of the slide, the inset shows the original alignment in blue and the shifted alignment in black. The alignment was shifted to maintain a 100-foot minimum buffer around wells. These water supply wells are located behind the berm of a water treatment plant adjacent to the project. This horizontal alignment shift also led to a reduction in stream and wetland impacts. During discussions at the Concurrence Point 4A meeting, the project team determined there was an opportunity to further minimize impacts in this area. At wetland area labeled as CWA, the U-turn bulb can be shifted to the west, reducing impacts to the wetland. This new location project was shifted to the south to evaluate if the realignment would minimize impacts to wetlands. The red area represents a reduction in impacts, while the yellow area shows where new impacts would occur as a result of the shift. It was determined the new alignment, shown in orange, would reduce wetland impacts by approximately 0.83 acre. This slide shows a widening project using a retaining wall, highlighted in red, as a minimization technique. Without the use of retaining walls, the project limits would extend to where the blue lines intersect the black dashed existing ground line. Information that should be presented at the Concurrence Point 4A meeting for both new location and widening projects includes an environmental features map, a discussion of avoidance and minimization efforts to date, wetland and surface water impact tables, and recommendations from Concurrence Point 2A concerning bridge lengths and culverts. If the project team did not concur on bridge lengths or culvert requirements at Concurrence Point 2A, the team should do so at this point. Information on other impacted resources should be addressed as appropriate. This slide shows an example of an environmental features map. The environmental features map will typically include the preliminary design with service road locations, utility relocations, and control of access. In addition to the environmental features map, the project engineer may choose to present the preliminary design on preliminary mapping along with the potential environmental impacts if this type of mapping would better facilitate discussions. Typical sections for the LEDPA should also be presented. This slide shows an example of a stream's impact table. The stream impacts table should include stream name and site identification number, if it is perennial or intermittent, the best usage classification, stream width and depth, impacted length, and Zone 1 and Zone 2 buffer impacts if applicable. Similarly, the Wetland Impacts table should include wetland site identification number and wetland type, the DWQ rating, if it is riverine or non-riverine, isolated or adjacent, and impacts in acres. At the Concurrence Point 4A meeting, it is helpful to provide the project team a summary table of how impacts were reduced through avoidance and minimization measures. In this case, reductions in impacts are highlighted in red text. Note that on the Concurrence Point 4A signature form, Section 404 Avoidance and Minimization measures should be documented first and separately from other avoidance and minimization measures. The following slides show additional examples of ways avoidance and minimization measures can be included in a project. In this example, the roadway was realigned to the south. The red highlighted area shows where wetlands are avoided as a result of the realignment. The yellow shows newly impacted areas. The new alignment, shown in orange, would reduce wetland impacts by approximately 2 acres. This example involves an interchange. The inset slide in the upper right-hand corner shows the original interchange design in blue and the modified design in black. Avoidance and minimization at this interchange included pulling in the loops and ramps and pulling back control along the L line. The dashed blue lines represent areas where avoidance and minimization was achieved as a result. The 2 circles at the top left of the slide show where barriers were used to reduce impacts to a shopping center and a cemetery. Impacts to wetland area labeled as ZWY, shown in the small circle at the bottom of the screen, were avoided. Impacts were minimized at the wetland area labeled PD04, shown at the top right of the screen. The 2 larger circles at the bottom of the slide show where property impacts were reduced near ramps A and D. This slide shows another area on Ramp D where the alignment shift minimized impacts, in this case to wetland area BWD and the stream labeled B-Ditch 1, which is a tributary to outstanding resource waters. Impacts to properties were also minimized. When reviewing avoidance and minimization measures with the project team, it is helpful to note where such measures were evaluated but determined not to be reasonable or feasible. In this example, shifting the Ramp D alignment to the northwest to avoid impacts to wetland area BWD was evaluated. However, this would have decreased functionality by creating a dogleg intersection, extended a free-flow lane over the bridge, adding another 4,200 square feet to the structure, impacted a cemetery in an area where graves are located, and likely required the addition of a signal within 600 feet of an existing signal. This slide shows anticipated impacts to a site proposed for the National Register of Historic Places. A church is located within the boundary to the west, and a cemetery is located within the boundary to the east. Prior to avoidance and minimization, the existing roadway in front of the church was widened to include an exit lane for a ramp in the northwest quadrant of the interchange from our previous example. As noted, impacts around the interchange were avoided or minimized by pulling in ramps and loops. As a result of modifying the ramp in Quadrant A to an angular exit, a full exit lane was no longer needed in front of the church property. In addition, the storage length for the right turn lane between the 2 historic boundaries was reduced, and control was pulled in along the L line. Through these minimization efforts, impacts to the historic property were reduced by approximately 1/2 acre. Finally, this is an example of a new location project in a preserved corridor with limited control of access. In this case, the addition of a retaining wall avoids impacts at wetland area PD01. Also, access was retained at a street with only one entrance to minimize residential impacts.